Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Shawn Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. We've been to dark places in these first few episodes. A woman dancing herself nearly to death in the streets of Strasbourg, a dead pope propped on a throne in Rome, armed men hunting a ghost through a wartime Illinois city. Heavy material, all of it, the kind of history that settles into you and stays. This week is different. This week, we are going to Australia. The year is 1932. The Great Depression is grinding the world down to its bones. Wheat prices have collapsed. A group of desperate men, veterans of the First World War, given land by a grateful government that promptly forgot about them, are watching their livelihoods disintegrate in the red dust of the Western Australian outback. And then 20,000 emus show up. And the Australian government, faced with this crisis, makes a decision that will be remembered forever as one of the most magnificently, spectacularly, undeniably absurd military operations in recorded history. They declare war. On the emus, they send in the army with machine guns against birds. The birds win. Now, before you dismiss this as a quirky footnote, a comedy bit that somehow found its way into the history books, I want to ask you to sit with the full story. Because underneath the absurdity, which is genuine and which we will absolutely be exploring in detail, there is a human story. A story about men who survived one war only to be sent into another that nobody could possibly take seriously. A story about government failure, economic desperation, and the particular humiliation of being defeated resoundingly and publicly by a large, flightless bird. The Great Emu War is funny. It is also, if you look at it closely enough, quietly heartbreaking. New episodes every Tuesday at 5 in the morning. Sources are always in the episode description. Let's begin. Western Australia, the Campion District, November 2nd, 1932. Major Gwynedd Purves, Wyn Aubrey Meredith, stands in a dry, flat field in the middle of absolute nowhere and surveys the situation before him. He is a career artillery officer in the Royal Australian Artillery, a man who has spent his professional life studying the science of ballistic trajectories and the principles of bringing overwhelming firepower to bear on a target. He served in the First World War. He knows what weapons can do. His target today is a mob of approximately 50 emus standing in a field about 300 yards away, eating something that probably used to be a wheat crop. He has 2 Lewis light machine guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, 2 soldiers, Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran, and, somewhat inexplicably, a cinematographer from Fox Movietone News. Because someone in the Defense Ministry thought this would make good newsreel footage. The plan is straightforward. The local farmers will help herd the emus into a concentrated mass. Meredith will wait until they are clustered close enough that a burst of machine gun fire will dispatch as many as possible in a single engagement. Quick, efficient, decisive. The farmers begin herding. The emus do not cooperate. Instead of clustering together, they scatter. Not randomly, not in the chaotic, panicked way of animals that don't understand what's happening. They split into small groups of 5, 10, 15 birds and simply go in different directions. Each cluster moves off at a brisk, purposeful trot toward a different point on the horizon. Within minutes, the 50 emus that had been in the field are distributed across several hundred acres of scrubland, each small group too spread out to be worth a burst of machine gun ammunition and moving too fast across rough terrain to be chased down. Meredith fires anyway. He gets a few. This is how the Great Emu War begins. It will not get better from here. Act 1. The world that made this possible. To understand the Great Emu War, you have to understand three things. You have to understand what emus actually are. You have to understand what the Campion District was in 1932. And you have to understand what the Great Depression was doing to the men who lived there. Let's start with the emus, because they deserve a proper introduction. The emu is the second largest bird in the world. After the ostrich, an adult stands nearly 6 feet tall and weighs between 80 and 130 pounds. It cannot fly, its wings are vestigial, reduced over millions of years of evolution to small appendages that serve mainly for temperature regulation, but it does not need to fly because it can run at nearly 30 miles an hour over sustained distances. It has only 3 toes, each tipped with a hard nail, and its legs are powerful enough to deliver a kick that can shatter timber and break bones. Beneath its shaggy brown and black feathers sits a thick pad of fat and muscle that makes it surprisingly resistant to injury. A bullet that strikes an emu at anything other than a direct hit to a vital organ is quite likely to slow it down without stopping it. A slowed down emu can still cover a significant distance before it finally drops, which creates the specific tactical problem of never knowing, in the middle of an engagement, exactly how many birds you have actually killed. Emus are part of the ratites, a group of large, flightless birds with evolutionary lineage stretching back to the age of dinosaurs. They have been in Australia for millions of years. They are woven into the cosmology of the Aboriginal Australians who lived alongside them long before European settlers arrived, appearing in Dreamtime stories as creator spirits and in the Aboriginal astronomical tradition as a constellation defined not by bright stars, but by the dark nebulae between them. The emu in the sky is formed from darkness rather than light, which is a remarkable inversion of how most cultures read the night sky, and which says something interesting about a people who had developed an intimate relationship with this bird over tens of thousands of years. European settlers had a different relationship with the emu. They saw it as vermin. By 1922, the Australian government had officially reclassified emus from protected native species to pests that could be killed without restriction. This reclassification was driven by genuine farmer complaints about crop damage, but it also reflected a broader attitude toward the Australian landscape, an attitude that treated the land and everything on it as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a system to be understood and worked with. The other thing to know about emus, the thing that matters most to our story, is that when something frightens them, they scatter every time, without fail. Every bird in a group breaks in a different direction. The instant danger appears. This is not learned behavior. It is baked into the animal's neurology at the deepest level, refined over millions of years of evolution in a landscape full of predators. They scatter, they move fast, and they do not reconsolidate until the threat is gone and the landscape is quiet again. This survival strategy has served them exceptionally well against dingoes and drought and every other hazard the Australian outback has thrown at them for millions of years. It will serve them exceptionally well against machine guns. Now, the Campion District. The Campion District sits in the wheat belt of Western Australia, a vast, flat, relentlessly dry region east of Perth, where the cleared land stretches to enormous, featureless horizons, and the sky is the biggest thing in any direction. The soil is poor and sandy. The rainfall is unreliable. The summers are brutal. The distances between things are significant. It is difficult country in almost every sense of the word. After the First World War, the Australian government launched a program called Soldier Settlement. Veterans would be given parcels of land in underdeveloped parts of Australia and encouraged to farm it. The government would help them get started. They would build something that would heal. They would contribute to the national economy. On paper, it was a generous and sensible idea. Give the returning men something to own, somewhere to put all that restless, damaged energy. In practice, it was a disaster in slow motion. The land allocated to soldier settlers in Western Australia was, in many cases, land that experienced farmers would have politely declined. The soil was thin. The clearing costs were enormous. The yields were uncertain, even in good years, and good years were not as frequent as the government had implied when it handed out the grants. Many of the men who received this land had no farming experience whatsoever. They had been soldiers and tradesmen and factory workers, and they were now expected to master wheat cultivation in conditions that challenged even those who had grown up doing it. There were no established neighbors to learn from, no accumulated local wisdom about which soils held moisture and which varieties of wheat survived the dry years. They were starting from nothing, in the middle of nowhere, with tools they barely knew how to use. Some managed, many struggled from the start. And then, in 1929, the Great Depression arrived and dismantled what little stability they had built. Wheat prices on world markets collapsed. A farmer selling his harvest at a viable price in 1928 was selling the same harvest in 1932 for a fraction of what it cost him to grow. The arithmetic of farming in the Campion district, already difficult, became impossible. The government had promised subsidies to bridge the gap and had not delivered them. By 1932, a quarter of the soldier settlers in the region had already walked off their land entirely, not sold it, not handed it back through any formal process, just left. The ones who remained were holding on with stubbornness and desperation, and the particular refusal of men who had survived the trenches of France to let a dry paddock beat them. Picture one of these men. He has spent 4 years in the mud of the Western Front. He has come home when so many others didn't. He has built something here, cleared the scrub by hand, strung fences post by post, planted the seed, waded through dry springs and scorching summers, learned from failure, tried again. He has a house in the red dust of the wheat belt, maybe a wife, maybe children growing up in the heat and the silence of the outback. He has made something from nothing in a place that resisted being made into anything. And now the wheat price has collapsed, the subsidies haven't come, his neighbors are walking away, and somewhere out beyond his broken fence line, he can hear the low, continuous rumble of 20,000 large birds moving toward everything he has left. Emus migrate annually after their breeding season, moving from the dry interior toward the coast in search of water and food. This migration had been happening for tens of thousands of years before there were any wheat farms in the Campion district. The birds followed old routes across the landscape, roots worn into their instincts over generations, moving in the long, unhurried way of animals that have no particular reason to hurry. They had done this every year. They would do it every year. But the farms had changed the landscape in ways that made the migration suddenly catastrophically relevant. The farmers had cleared the native scrub, sunk water troughs for their livestock, and planted flat, open fields full of grain. From an emu's perspective, this was an extraordinary improvement on the landscape. Food, water, open ground, no predators. The Campion district, by 1932, was exactly the kind of habitat that a large, hungry, nomadic bird would seek out. The emus were not invading. They were doing what they had always done, following the same routes, driven by the same instincts, in a landscape that had been quietly remade into something irresistible. 20,000 of them arrived in the district that year. The sound of them moving across the flat land was something the farmers described later as a kind of continuous, low rumble, like distant thunder that never resolved into a storm. They came in waves, group after group, spreading across the fields in their characteristic unhurried trot, heads bobbing, eyes alert, eating as they walked. They ate the wheat. They trampled what they didn't eat. They pushed through the rabbit-proof fencing the farmers had built, leaving gaps that rabbits promptly used to cause their own additional wave of damage. They moved in groups too large and too fast for individual farmers with rifles to manage. A man could go out in the morning with his gun and spend the whole day shooting and make no meaningful dent in 20,000 birds. The damage accumulated daily, and in the context of everything else these men were already dealing with, it pushed several of them toward the edge of ruin. The farmers wrote to their members of parliament, they wrote to anyone who might listen, and they had a very specific request rooted directly in their military experience. They wanted machine guns. They had seen what sustained machine gun fire could do to a concentrated mass of living things advancing across open ground. They applied that knowledge to the problem before them. It seemed, from the inside, completely reasonable. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, agreed. He approved a small military deployment to the Campion district, armed with 2 Lewis light machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, with orders to assist the farmers in culling the emu population. Nobody in the Defense Ministry apparently had thought very carefully about what emus actually do when they are frightened. ACT-2. The War Major Meredith arrived in the Campion district in late October, accompanied by Sergeant McMurray, Gunner O'Halloran, 2 Lewis guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and the Fox Movietone cinematographer. The operation had been delayed by rain that had scattered the emu population over a wider area than anticipated. By the time the rain stopped and the campaign began in earnest, it was November 2nd. The Lewis gun was a light machine gun developed during the First World War for suppressing infantry and destroying fixed positions. It fired at 500 rounds per minute and was most effective against targets that stayed still, that advanced in formation, or that could be predicted to move in a particular direction. It was devastatingly effective on the Western Front against human beings in trenches and formation. It was a deeply suboptimal weapon for shooting at animals that scattered the moment they sensed danger, ran at 30 miles an hour across broken terrain, and whose bodies were built to absorb punishment and keep moving. Meredith did not know this yet. On November 2nd, approaching his first engagement, he had every reason for confidence. He had firepower. He had a plan. He had a cinematographer recording his victory. The emus scattered. He fired at the retreating birds and killed a small number. Accounts vary, but most suggest somewhere between a handful and perhaps a dozen on that first day. The cinematographer filmed dispersing brown shapes and a great deal of red dust. 2 days later, on November 4th, Meredith tried a different approach. He identified a dam where the emus were coming to drink and set up an ambush. He positioned his men in concealed locations around the water and waited through the morning. The emus came, more than 1,000 of them, moving toward the dam in the early light, a dark mass of long-legged birds crossing the flat ground in their characteristic gait, heads bobbing, feet raising small puffs of dust with each step, a low, collective rumble moving across the scrubland toward the water. Meredith waited until they were at point-blank range. He gave the order to fire. One of the Lewis guns jammed after a handful of rounds. The emus scattered. Meredith got the gun unjammed and fired into the retreating mob. He killed some. How many is unclear, since accounts from different sources vary enough to suggest that nobody was counting very carefully in the chaos. But the 1,000 emus who had been converging on that dam were now spread across the surrounding landscape in groups of 5 and 10 and 20, and there was no practical way to bring them together again. The ambush, that should have been decisive, had produced perhaps a dozen confirmed kills out of more than 1,000 birds. Meredith adapted his tactics. He mounted a Lewis gun on the back of a truck, reasoning that if the emus were mobile, the gun should be mobile too. A gunner in the truck bed could track fleeing birds across open terrain and bring the weapon to bear on scattered groups rather than waiting for a massed engagement that the emus had shown no inclination to provide. It was a reasonable tactical adjustment. It did not work. The emus could run nearly 30 miles an hour. The trucks, on unpaved roads and dry creek beds, and open scrubland, could not keep pace. And even when the vehicles did close the distance, the bouncing and jolting of the ride made accurate fire essentially impossible. The gunner was fighting the truck as much as the birds. At some point during this phase of the campaign, reportedly, one of the trucks crashed after hitting an emu at speed. The emu, apparently, got up and walked away. Whether this emu had been the intended target or simply an obstacle in the vehicle's path is not entirely clear from the sources. Either way, the image captures the entire operation rather well. By November 8th, after 6 days of operations, Meredith had confirmed kills somewhere in the low hundreds. The emu population of the Campion district remained at approximately 20,000. The crops were still being eaten. The fences were still being pushed through. Nothing had materially changed except that the Royal Australian Artillery had expended a significant portion of its ammunition on a problem it had not solved. The story had escaped into the newspapers. The Australian press discovered the Emu War and responded with undisguised delight. Headlines ran that barely bothered to conceal their amusement. Cartoonists went to work. Members of the House of Representatives debated the operation on the floor of Parliament, with one member suggesting that if any medals were to be awarded for gallantry in the field, they should go to the emus, who had won every round so far. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, was given a nickname he reportedly found less amusing than the public did, the Emu General. For the farmers watching all of this from the Campion district, the press coverage was a particular kind of humiliation. These men had asked for genuine help with a genuine crisis. They were losing their livelihoods. Some were going hungry. And now they were reading newspaper cartoons about army incompetence and listening to parliamentary jokes about brave emus being made into the national punchline of a story that had started as a desperate plea for assistance. The birds were still in the wheat fields. The fences were still down. Nothing had changed except that the entire country was now laughing at the Campion district. Meredith withdrew on November 8th. The operation was officially suspended pending further review. The farmers wrote more letters. They sent more delegations. They made clear that the emus were still there, still eating and trampling and destroying, and that something needed to happen. The Minister of Defense, apparently undeterred by the first phase of the campaign, approved a second deployment. Meredith returned to the Campion district on November 13th. The second phase went better, in the narrow sense that Meredith and his team found a more sustainable operational rhythm. Rather than trying to manufacture the kind of decisive, massed engagement that the terrain and the birds had made essentially impossible, they settled into patient attrition, finding small groups and engaging them with short, controlled bursts, accepting low kill rates per engagement, accumulating the numbers over days and weeks. They moved methodically across the district through the heat and the dust and the enormous flat silence of the Western Australian outback, chasing birds that were faster than their trucks and more numerous than their ammunition. By early December, they were killing approximately 100 emus per week. 100 emus per week. Out of 20,000, Meredith was recalled on December 10th. In his official report, he listed 986 confirmed kills achieved with 9,860 rounds of ammunition, a rate of exactly 10 rounds per confirmed kill, a neatness that suggests the numbers were rounded somewhere along the way. He noted that an additional 2,500 birds had likely died of their injuries after engagements, a figure that historians have treated with varying degrees of skepticism since dead emus in the Australian outback are not easy to count or verify. The report was, in its way, a masterpiece of military understatement. 986 confirmed kills, read against the backdrop of 20,000 emus still moving through the Campion district, still eating the wheat, still pushing through the fences. Those 986 kills represent something close to nothing. The Royal Australian Artillery had deployed with 10,000 rounds of ammunition and state-of-the-art light machine guns and had reduced the emu population by less than 5%. The operation had consumed significant government resources, occupied a military officer and 2 soldiers for over a month, and had been conducted under the scrutiny of a national and international press that was thoroughly enjoying itself at the army's expense. The emu population of the Campion district was functionally unchanged. The Great Emu War was over. The emus had won. Act 3. Aftermath. What the Emu War was really about. The Great Emu War became almost immediately a source of enormous amusement, and it has stayed that way. It gets written about, talked about, made into films and comic sketches and internet memes because the premise is irresistible. The Australian army went to war with birds, and the birds won. You cannot improve on that as a comic premise. It is perfect. But I want to stay with it a little longer, because there's more here than the joke. Major Meredith was a good sport about the whole thing. He was a professional officer who had been given an impossible assignment and done his best with it, and his subsequent remarks about the emus were generous rather than defensive. He compared them, more than once, to Zulu warriors in terms of their ability to absorb punishment and keep moving, their natural tactical instincts, their resilience under fire. He said that if his unit had been equipped with tanks, the outcome might have been different. He was probably not entirely wrong. But the more interesting figure in this story is not Meredith. It is the farmers. The men who requested military intervention were, almost without exception, First World War veterans. Many had served on the Western Front. They had seen what machine guns did to a concentrated mass of living things advancing across open ground. They had watched their friends die in exactly that way, advancing in formation toward fortified positions, cut down by sustained fire before they could close the distance. They carried that knowledge in their bodies, in the way that experiences of that magnitude tend to live not just in memory but in muscle and bone, and they applied it reasonably and specifically to the problem before them, herd the emus into formation, and machine gun them. The same principle, the same technology. It should work. What they had not accounted for was that emus are not infantrymen. Infantrymen advance on orders. They hold formation under fire because discipline and training and the presence of officers require it. Emus have no officers. They have no orders. They have only instincts that are millions of years old, and those instincts say, scatter. Always scatter. The machine gun that had been so catastrophically effective against human beings in formation was almost useless against animals that refused to form up and that scattered the instant danger appeared. There is something dark and quietly unbearable in that symmetry if you sit with it long enough. These men had survived a war in which the weapon, now aimed at birds, had been aimed at them and at everyone they knew. They had come home. The government had given them land as a reward and as a way of managing the problem of hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers with nowhere to put themselves. They had worked that land through drought and isolation and the grinding economics of the Depression, through the loneliness of the outback and the particular indignity of failing at farming when you were a veteran of a war. The country had honored you for surviving. And when the government finally sent someone out to help, it sent 3 men and 2 machine guns and a cinematographer. The cinematographer. I keep coming back to the cinematographer. Someone in the defense ministry had pictured this as a triumph, newsreel footage of decisive action, a government solving its citizens' problems, machine guns doing what machine guns do. Instead, they got footage of confused soldiers firing at receding brown shapes across flat land, and then a lot of dust, and then silence. The footage that exists from the campaign is not triumphant. It is almost melancholy, in the way that footage of failed things often is. The government refused every subsequent request for military assistance. The farmers asked in 1934, when the emus came back in large numbers, refused. They asked in 1943, during the Second World War, when another large migration caused serious damage to the crops. Refused presumably on the grounds that the army had more urgent concerns than birds, they asked in 1948. Refused again. The official position, after the 1932 debacle, was that the army had better things to do than repeat the Campion experiment. Instead, the government established and expanded a bounty system. Farmers who killed emus could claim a small payment per bird on presentation of the beak. In 6 months of 1934 alone, Western Australian farmers collected bounties on 57,000 emu kills. The bounty system did what the army had been unable to do, because it was carried out by people who knew the land, who understood how emus moved, who had the patience to stalk them individually over time, rather than trying to herd them into machine gun fire. It was distributed, sustained, and effective. It was the opposite of a newsreel. The real long-term solution was fencing. Better fences, higher fences, properly maintained, that kept the emus out of the wheat fields without requiring anyone to shoot anything at all. Unglamorous. No newsreel footage. No parliamentary comedy. But effective in a way that machine guns had not been, because it addressed the actual problem, emus getting into the crops, rather than trying to eliminate the emus entirely, which was never going to be achievable and probably shouldn't have been the goal. The ornithologist Dominic Cervantes' description of the campaign has become the most quoted writing from the entire episode. He wrote that the machine gunners' dreams of point-blank fire into massed formations of emus had been quickly dissipated, that the emu command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and that the unwieldy army of birds had split into innumerable small units that made the military equipment uneconomical. He wrote it as scientific observation. It reads like a dispatch from a war that the wrong side won. And it contains, buried in its dry ornithological language, something genuinely interesting, the acknowledgement that the emus had not simply run away. They had, within the logic of their own instincts, done exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, in a way that rendered the technology arrayed against them essentially useless. The emus, for their part, continued to do exactly what they had always done. They migrated, they ate, they reproduced. They pushed through fences and drank from water troughs and moved across the wheat belt in their enormous, unhurried migrations. They had no awareness of having won anything. They were just emus, doing emu things, in the landscape that had been theirs for millions of years before anyone planted wheat in it. The cleared farmland, the water troughs, the gaps in the fences from the emu's perspective, this was simply the world as it now was, a world that had recently become considerably more hospitable than it used to be. They were taking advantage of that hospitality. They did not understand that their hosts considered them pests. The emus had been in Australia for millions of years. The wheat farms had been there for a few decades. The men who were trying to shoot the emus had been given the land by a government that had taken it in the not very distant past from the Aboriginal Australians who had lived alongside the emus for thousands of years without declaring war on them. The whole episode, the soldier settlers, the failed farms, the desperate requests for military assistance, the machine guns against birds, was the product of a long chain of decisions about land and who it belonged to and what it was for. The emus were not the cause of any of that. They were just migrating the way they had always migrated, through terrain that had been remade around them without their consent or awareness. In 1999, emus were declared a protected species in Australia. The truce, such as it was, had finally been made official. No emus were present to sign it. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Shawn Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.